Hello, everyone. This is part one of week 7 of Plato, a class on the Protagoras, Phaedo, and Sophist. We continue to talk about the Phaedo. The Phaedo contains a number of proposals on the nature of the mind or soul and its relation to the body. Some of these proposals are part of the arguments for the immortality of the soul that Plato is laying out, and I suggested earlier that we should read these arguments not only with respect to are they really compelling as demonstrations of the immortality of the soul, but also just with a view to what can we learn from them about Plato's metaphysics. And I would like to add to this today and suggest that we also look at each of these arguments and the objections raised against them with a view to what kinds of accounts of what the mind is and how it relates to the body come up here. The Phaedo has an incredible position in the history of Western philosophy, in part because Plato is here laying out perennial questions about how can we make sense of what the mind is, how it relates to the body. He's laying out some options for how can we think of this relationship. Now, today I want to talk about one particular such account, that is what comes up when Simmias raises an objection. He is not quite convinced yet by Socrates' attempts to demonstrate the immortality of the soul. And he thinks that he is kind of capturing a widespread intuition when he says that, well, maybe the soul is something like the attunement of a musical instrument. And he uses the Greek instrument lyre as his example. That is something like a small harp. It has a kind of wooden frame and strings. And the thought is that if the wood and the strings and all of it is sort of put together in quite the right way, then the musical instrument is attuned. And then it gives rise to music and so on and so forth. So now you have something beautiful, where before you had bits of wood and bits of string. And maybe that is how we can think about the human body being a kind of very complex organization put together, as it were, quite the right measure, as Plato puts it. And then when that is the case, there is attunement. And that is what the soul is. Socrates raises objections against this proposal. And I want to just mention some of them, with a view in particular to questions that they raise in the philosophy of mind. The first question that I want to raise is about the kind of dependence relation that we see here. So the proposal is the soul is dependent on the body. Only if the body is in the sort of right kind of condition, everything's sort of put together in the right kind of way, then there is attunement and then you have the soul. Now, you might ask, is that genuinely a dependence relation that runs from body to soul? So the soul is dependent on the body. Or is it instead a dependence relation where it kind of runs from body to something more refined body? And why might you think that? Even though initially it is being said that, an attunement, that is a kind of beautiful, divine, incorporeal thing. Nevertheless, this attunement is described as a crisis, a mixture of elements like wet and cold and hot and dry and so on and so forth. So that sounds like a kind of mix of physical components. And Socrates also goes on to speak of the soul as this harmony account envisages it as composite. And initially we thought that, well, composites, they are on the side of corporeal things, whereas the soul might be a non-composite. So the first question I want to raise is just, if you take the harmony account of the soul seriously, is the soul really still incorporeal? Or is it just something kind of more rarefied, but still corporeal? The second question I want to raise, also sort of coming out of an objection that Socrates brings up, is whether it is the case that this harmony account can only explain the coming about of the soul, or, and that's what we really need, the coming about of particular mental states. Socrates treats this notion of an attunement as an on-off notion. Either a musical instrument is attuned or it isn't. You can think of this as there are no unharmonious harmonies. Either you have a harmony or you don't. At least that is how Plato puts it. So it then looks as if on this model, either you have a soul or not, and really what you explain is that people have a soul. But any kind of change here would mean that you're kind of taking away from the attunement, so you no longer have a soul. But really, when we think about mental states, we want to explain how mental states change, how someone thinks, how someone, moves through a series of steps in an argument. Or we also want to explain that someone is a better person than someone else, someone is virtuous, someone is knowledgeable. So we want to explain differences in mental states. And I want to sort of just invite you to consider these two questions. On the harmony account of the soul, is the soul genuinely incorporeal? And second, can the model explain different mental states and changes in mental states?